Hello, this is Jackie Walker, Redline TV, and we are what I would call have been just through the very best and the very worst of times. I mean, the best of times is that we have actually got rid of the Tories, and it was nice seeing them go down. There's no doubt about that. But we, instead of the Tories, we have Starmer. And already within the first couple of days, we can see the trouble that is ahead. We have seen they've opened up, what, £30 billion worth of contracts for the NHS. We can see that the differential way that he's responded to the bombing of the Children's Hospital in Ukraine as compared to how he's treated Palestine. We've already heard that they're not going to spend a penny on council housing. We can see there's going to be trouble ahead. Many of us, well, certainly for me, I was actually really uplifted by our results. When I say our, I'm counting all the independents, all the Greens, in a way what I would think of as the counter Labour vote. We did astonishingly well, astonishingly well. And some people look at Jeremy, but I'm also looking not just at the people who actually got in as MPs, but also the amount of second placements there was. I mean, that gives the left a huge amount to build on. And then on top of that, we've had what's going on in France. And what's going to be good about this evening's programme is that we're going to be putting the two of those things together. So we have a mixture of people from Redline TV, and we also have an activist called Jane Lee. The great thing about Jane Lee is she's sort of not just bilingual, she's kind of bi-country. So she kind of lives in both areas as well and is very well informed about politics on both sides. So we're going to really, really bring this together. But if I can start first, Graham, can you give us your input on what for you was the big takeaway from the English, the British general election?
So I think there were mixed results, overall much more positive than I thought they would be. Firstly, as you said, the smashing of the Tories, it takes them out of the equation, and it now means there could and probably will be a fight between a movement of resistance and the Labour government. And I think that's really important. On the other hand, of course, in addition, let me firstly say that there was a really wonderful achievement of Jeremy. Just full stop, it was wonderful. We would be feeling very different if he hadn't had that level of victory. And also the independents. And as you say, also many of them who didn't get in put up a wonderful fight. But there's two problems. One is the fragile base for Labour. For all their attack on Jeremy's vote in 2019, actually the Labour vote's gone down since then, and the share of the vote's only slightly gone up. And secondly, it's the vote for reform. Only 4 MPs, but 4 million votes. So that means, looking at France as well, the way we fight that has got to be in a movement, a unified movement. And I think that movement means now it's primarily outside of the electoral arena, out of the parliamentary arena, and certainly, for the moment, at least, certainly outside of the Labour Party. Now, the only point I now want to just finish off with, because you've warned me not to talk too much, is that we have to build this unified grassroots movement, no one excluded, to unite the various struggles amongst all the supporters, the army of supporters for the independents and Jeremy, in the trade unions, in the Gaza movement, everything else. And we saw, as Jeremy said at the demonstration, this is the kernel of a mass movement. So I think it's the movement at this stage we're going to try and build. Talk of alternative parties are vastly premature. I wish it wasn't, but it is. Remember, no alternative party, I don't include the Greens like Jackie, but no alternative party of the left won a seat. And I think we've got to recognise where we're at and try to build through unifying the various levels of struggle. To unify the left is a Herculean task, as we've found out through most of our lifetimes, that is what is posed, because there's going to be a collision between the Labour government and the Labour movement, and I think there's a danger of a real drift to the right. And to fight that, we need a movement from below to counter it. We saw what happened in France through that. That has itself an electoral expression through that movement, and that's what we've got to learn from these elections.
Okay, thank you. And Becky, you were down in the Brighton area, weren't you? And you had some, very specific conditions you were working with. What was the election like for you?
Well, for me, I was working in Hove, which is Peter Kyle's Labour seat. And we had an independent, Tanushka Marar, and she went from 0, nobody knew who Tanushka was, to over 3,000 votes. So when we began, we were thinking, well, if we get in 4 figures, that's going to be good from nothing. But she actually polled over 3,000 votes. There was also a Green candidate standing in Hove, effectively really a paper candidate, but of course, took a lot of votes. Despite that, Peter Kyle would still have got elected. And I'll come back to that if I may. Brighton Pavilion was held by the Greens. Caroline Lucas had retired. Labour threw a lot at it with their candidate, but didn't really get traction in Brighton Pavilion. And Brighton Kemp Town was really just terribly unfortunate, because after the election had been called and campaigning had begun, the Labour Party removed the sitting MP, Lloyd Russell Moyle, and parachuted in Keir Starmer's bag carrier. Well, obviously that was deeply unpopular amongst Labour members. So I don't think there was hardly any canvassing, but he got elected, and he got elected on Lloyd's vote, because Lloyd had taken that seat from the Tories. So it was a mixture of Tory collapse and Lloyd's work that put him in. But coming back to Hove, I was doing a lot of stalls and street campaigning, and allied to the post-election results, something struck me. Graham's talked about the actual drop in the vote. I mean, this was not Labour sailing into power on a cry of joy from the population, far from it. And the 2 people whose feet were toasted the most, Wes Streeting and Jess Phillips, I would say they are the gobshites par excellence of the Labour Party. And generally people know them, know what they say, know their attitudes. And what I found on the streets of Hove, Peter Kyle goes under the radar. He doesn't do much social media. He keeps very quiet. He just will retweet Starmer stuff. But Peter Kyle himself, you'd be very hard pressed, really, if you're an ordinary person, to know about him. But as soon as you start talking to people and they say, oh, well, Peter's quite nice. I always describe him as motherhood and apple pie, because that's the image he likes to project. But when you say to them, well, actually, he's vice chair of Labour Friends of Israel, I didn't know that. Yes, he is. Actually, he hasn't said a word about Gaza since October, not one word about genocide. I didn't know that. And he's in favour of privatising the NHS. I didn't know that. So the lesson really that I've learned is that people like Streeting and Phillips, who are very out there, yeah, got their feet roasted a bit. But somebody like Peter Kyle, who's under the radar, people believe the image he projects. So I don't know. What I've taken away is we need to do a lot more work in our own areas, exposing who our own MPs are. That would help for a start. Thank you.
I think that's a really important thing, because there was a comment today on social media about somebody having got in. Oh, it was Luke Akehurst. And they were saying, well, he got in, the people of Durham aren't stupid. Well, actually, if you look, most people do not know individual candidates. They have no idea what their records are. And I think you're quite right. We should be doing a lot more work wherever we are in keeping people informed during this period about what their MPs are doing and saying and what they've done. Norman Thomas, you're down in Thanet, and of course, Thanet is well known for having been the last place where Farage didn't get in, and you, like I, and actually like Jane Lee, were kind of involved in that sort of campaign to keep out Farage. I hear you have a new Labour MP down there. So, as they say, how was it for you?
Yeah, I think you've been misinformed. We haven't got a new Labour MP. We've got a new Tory MP because, and I think this is where the one part I would disagree with what Graham Bash said, was saying that the Tories have been routed. The Tories have got back into power in a huge way because the Labour Party, I can't see any difference between the Labour Party that we've now got, Starmer's Labour Party, and the Tory Party. And unfortunately, the Tories who are left, the rump of the Tory party that are in there, will just join with Starmer on whatever vote he wants to go with. So what's going to be the difference? The opposition is, as you say, is amongst the independents and maybe the Greens, and Reform is going to be forming its own kind of opposition, although they will stand with a large part of the Tory party anyway. So there's a huge majority in parliamentary terms for what I would call a Labour Tory party. They've already formed a kind of coalition of interests. And that's very depressing. And it's all the more depressing because Starmer has, as we know, following the new Labour playbook, imposed a really authoritarian discipline on his party. He will expel or discipline anyone who tries to vote against the party line. He's really prepared for a fight. Starmer wants a fight. He doesn't want a peaceful time. He doesn't see any interest in that. He is interested in fighting protest movements. He's well aware of what Graham is saying about this thing from the below, the protest from below, and he's gearing up all the laws and strategies he can think of to stop it. That's what Starmer's got a whole track record in. His whole history is in fighting any form of upsurge from below, as seen in what he was doing as a director of public prosecutions against the riots of people of color in the past. He is absolutely up for a fight. And that's the big danger, that we've got somebody like that now in charge. But I do totally agree with Graham that we've got to fight it, but it is going to be a huge fight, and we've got to fight very hard. In Thanet, it was quite depressing having nominally a Labour Party victory, but somebody who would say very little different from our later Tory MP, apart from our Tory MP that we had, Craig McKinley, would have been different on things like climate change and this, that, and the other. But really, there's very little to choose between them. And we had one independent candidate who was speaking out for Palestine, and he got about 90 votes or something. I voted for him. I gave him my vote, but he had no hope at all of getting very far with anything. But I am encouraged by what's going on across the country. I thought, and I'll end with this, the absolutely best result of the night, apart from Jeremy, because I think that was a very encouraging result, apart from Jeremy, was Shochat Adams up in Leicester South, where, because we'd filmed him for a film we were doing, and in that film, he said in April at a conference, he said he was standing because he'd gone to Jonathan Ashworth, the horrific Labour MP who was in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet and who betrayed Jeremy, set him up with some phony discussion on a phone where he said that Jeremy was poisoned on the doorstep. And it was obviously a set-up job. Husband of Emily Oldnow, a very, very dodgy, distasteful character. And he went to him, Shockley Adams went to him and said, will you call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza? And Ashworth didn't even bother to give him a response. They gave it 72 hours later. Ashworth had said not a word to him. And that was when Shockley decided to stand. And he stood and he overturned a huge majority, 20,000 or so majority of Ashworth, and won. And he is an absolutely brilliant candidate. And I just hope the other independents are as good as him. But that is the great encouragement that more can come from that area and that we can support those people to do what we need to do, which is to fight the Tories. And when I say the Tories, I mean the Labour and the Tories combined, because we'll have to fight them combined, because they will combine against what we do. So,
well, I think that's obvious that they will combine, and we see that. We actually see that happening. There was this wonderful scene repeated on television and on radio where they were both slapping each other on the back, saying how wonderful we are. We can do this exchange of power. We're not like the Americans. And then you had Starmer saying how Sunak was a jolly good chap. And you had Sunak saying how Starmer was a decent sort of a fellow. And that's what we've got totally. Jane Lee, if you could let us have your take on the British election, but obviously why you're here is we really want to know more about what's going on in France. And I'm particularly interested in as well the fact that immediately as these elections have happened, we've been told that Mélenchon is actually an anti-Semite. We have the chief rabbi of France, etc., coming out. I mean, I think we're all familiar with this. So Jane Lee, what have you got to say?
Well, at least Jean-Luc Guité just turns around and says that's nonsense, he and defends himself. There's certainly no trimming, no sort of, oh, I'm terribly sorry if I've hurt anybody's feelings. Mélenchon's not really the kind of guy to do that. I agree with Norman, but I think I'd even go further about the British election. I think that Keir is more dangerous in a way, because although the Tory government for the last few years has just been a sort of holding government to make sure that nobody stops the asset stripping of Great Britain, and upsets the establishment profiteering. I think there's something more aggressive about Keir Starmer, not just personally, but considering the people that he's put in his cabinet today and yesterday. I think we have an aggressive move to the right. And it shocked me this morning when I read the headlines of the Times. France plunged into chaos as the left take over. And then, the article is, if Marine Le Pen had party had won, it's the only real party. They're the only ones with a plan. But now it's chaotic because the left have won. I mean, and all of these things, of course, point out how bankrupt our political system is, how bankrupt our corporate party system is.
Could you tell us, Jane Lee? I mean, there's been a lot of talk today. There's been a lot of centrists kind of claiming Mélenchon as one of theirs. I don't know if you noticed that. Can you, for our viewers, can you place him for us politically?
Sure. La France Insoumise is Mélenchon's party has a very particular philosophy, there are two books by Mélenchon. One is essentially his manifesto, and the other one is the Bismarck one, which is a more philosophical book. Basically, Mélenchon has the idea. one which has been raised, I think, even today, that that political action is not just parliamentary action, and that what we have to do to have a democracy is to engage all forms of political action, which means that people who have a single issue are, if they're in the street for that single issue, are still politically active and are exercising their democratic rights, which is why, of course, the street becomes so important to Mélenchon, but also the idea that we can all come together under a kind of an umbrella without having to knock the whole thing into a similar single note, without a whip, so to speak, that we can argue for hegemony of our own ideas within a constant conversation with people who also want to be Democrats and so want to listen as well as speak. So this has, although Mélenchon himself can sometimes be a bit rough around the edges and difficult with people, the philosophy which he is expounding has made it possible for some very important things to happen in France, and that have shown in the election, particularly, for instance, the LV, the Greens in France coming within the Front Populaire, and the ability of the Front Populaire to come together so quickly does depend upon a lot of groundwork that Mélenchon's been doing for 20 years. That in making sure that that we don't have these sort of monoculture corporate parties that so stymie our democratic system.
I think that's really interesting, because I think that is a question for, if you like, the British left at the moment. There's been a lot of notice, for example, today on George Galloway phoning up Corbyn and saying, will you be the leader of our movement? There's been a lot of discussion with people about how we should be looking at the Greens. And that I didn't know that about what was happening in terms of the French. So he'd already done that groundwork.
The LFI has been doing that groundwork for quite a while, and it came together very well during the presidential election a couple of years ago. But I think there is a difference between French and English parliamentarianism, in that French people expect the issue to be debated in the Assemblée, so that people come and actually talk about the thing. They don't go off hiving off into committee rooms within their party and knock out a single soundbite that will then go into Parliament and become part of a Punch and Judy show. When Macron rather admires that about Britain, he would in a sense have liked to have got his party more along those lines. But of course, what happened was that he was met with he was stonewalled in the Assemblée, and even though Elizabeth Bourne brought in Section 48, which means you can cut through to do something urgently in the Assemblée, the Prime Minister Elizabeth Bourne, it ended up with the Assemblée leaving, standing up and walking out. Either we're here to debate the issue as equals, or we're not, and they simply walked out. So there is a difference in Parliament in France, which makes a different context for the coming together of the Front Populaire. But what's amazing to me, what's wonderful really, is the spirit of Léon Blum in all of this. That, every town in France has a square Léon Blum. and they finally remembered what it was for, you know, who Léon Blum was in 1936, what the Front Populaire was. And because they and by identifying that, it was Ruffin who identified it. What they did was identify the danger of Le Pen, you know, that there was no question about it. Once they had said Front Populaire, and they don't say now the Nouveau Front Populaire, they say the Front Populaire, and they see themselves as an extension of 36. And they and that, of course, leaves Marine as the Pétainiste, as
Marine Le Pen, you're
Marine Le
talking
Pen,
about,
yes,
aren't
Marine
you?
Le Pen.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
sorry,
No, that's all right. What I'd like to do is, because I'm sure there are other people here who'd like to perhaps pick up some of your points. Graham.
Well, just a couple of things that came to my mind, not necessarily about what James just said. You're talking about how good some of these, well, we were talking about how good some of these independents are. I mean, the other one who came across really well on Crispin's show on Sunday was the comrade, I think, from Dewsbury, who came across really, really well. And again, his victory was based on previous organisation of the local elections, for instance, and it wasn't just out of the blue. I don't agree with comrades who are saying that the Tories are going to go in with Labour. Of course they won't. What the main danger is, they will go to their right and actually, under pressure, popular pressure, in the event of the government, which it will do, pissing off so many of its people. The danger is the Tories will go to their right and go make some link-ups with Farage and the Tories. And the problem we have, I think, is this, that now it's the far right have standard bearers in Parliament. And I think that's a real danger for us. I mean, I know we can swear about the Tories, etc., but what they weren't is were kind of semi-fascist. And I think that that what Farage represents is something that's very dangerous. A touch of almost the Trumps there as well.
But isn't what Jane is telling us, in a way, is that what we need to remind people of is the history of rightists, and in fact who is on the right and what that means and who is on the left. I am very interested, for example, the way, and somebody put a tweet like this out, and they said, you know, isn't it extraordinary that the party who has saved us from the fascists in France are now being called the racists? And we know this, don't we? This has happened to us.
And I think that, you know, the Reform Party, it shows, even though there are only 4 of them, they can grow. And if you look at the Le Peniste Party, which of course has been there a lot longer, you know, it's a very similar kind of movement. For one thing, I think the thing which is most striking is that the real strength of Marine Le Pen's party is in what was called La France profonde, the rural heart of France, where the people live in villages. They don't rely on the cities. They don't have the same. They're terrified of foreigners because they never see any. They've got no idea. But also they're, you know, they tend to be Catholic, they tend to be traditionalists and all of that sort of thing. But essentially they're the small towns and the villages. And of course her other support is in the kind of what they keep calling the left behind people here, the people who the deindustrialization has affected in the north of France. But so it's they have the same audience in a sense. I mean, the fact that it's Clacton, Clacton is exactly the kind of place where the Rassemblement National would go. They are very similar, and the policies which have come out, the policies of the right wing in France have become apartheid. You know, 2 different kinds of citizenship. They've become brutal. You know, new police powers. They're all policies which Reform are recommending.
Becky, are you seeing any links here between what's going on here and what's happening in France, particularly for the future? Are you seeing any lessons for the British?
Yeah, I mean, something that disturbs me for the future is when you look at Starmer's cabinet, I don't know what the percentage is, but it's incredibly high. They're nearly all Labour Friends of Israel. They subscribe to Zionism, so they're racist.
Yeah.
And when you read the sort of Zionist propaganda, and it's across Europe, as well as in the UK, it's this whole idea that white nations like France, the UK, Europe, are under threat from the Islamic hordes. And that is really taking traction. And so you're getting this unholy alliance between the Zionists and the active racists against Muslims. And perhaps later Jane might want to say something about how this is in France. But to be honest, that is the movement that really disturbs me. And it disturbs me because it's another thing that's happening under the radar again.
That how it is really now, and we've seen this, haven't we, is that you cannot, shall we say, get on anymore in the Labour Party unless you are signed up as a friend of Israel.
Yeah, but also if you actually look at some of the coverage of some of the results, how dare people of colour have a representative? How dare they have a voice?
Yeah.
How dare they influence the constituency in which they've lived for generations? How very dare they?
There has been some dreadful Islamophobia coming out about, I mean, you know, how scared we should be because we have independent Muslim MPs being elected. I mean, can you imagine what would happen if people were using those same descriptions and expressions about Jewish MPs? You know,
I can imagine very well.
I mean, it's been absolutely horrendous.
This is like an imperialist racist thing. So while we are flapping about Nigel Farage, which I agree is important, the racists around the cabinet table, the genocidaires are around the cabinet table. Yeah. The people sending bombs today to Ukraine are around the cabinet table. So in my mind, kind of, we don't need to speculate about racism. It's there. It's in number 10 Downing Street.
I'm afraid Graham is once again looking querulous at that. So
I am indeed. I mean, look, there's no equation between the Labour leadership, rotten imperialist establishment as it is, and Farage, who could represent a bridge to a mass movement of the far right. I mean, this is the mistake the Stalinists made in late 20s, early 30s Germany, when they called the rotten Socialist Party basically kind of social fascists. They're not the same, and we must be careful, because when we're trying to rebuild an alliance, there's still some socialists, and don't forget this, in the Labour Party, for whatever reason, I don't know how they've escaped being expelled, but I wouldn't have left voluntarily. Let me say that. And there's people in the Labour Party we have to build with. And I think when we're talking about a united front, there should be no exclusions. I mean, 2 examples. I don't like George Galloway, but you shouldn't exclude him. I don't like Owen Jones. You shouldn't exclude him. What we've got to do is develop both a sharp political programme, so including on asylum, Gaza, and all this, so that dodgy people will exclude themselves, both sharp politically, but as broad as possible, going into the trade union movement and having parliamentary representatives, including some, if they'll put their heads over the parapet, some members of the campaign group. And I think that we shouldn't exaggerate how things are to say basically the fascists are already in power. They most certainly aren't. And if they were, we would notice the difference.
Okay, let's have Becky.
Yeah, I just
come
want to
back
come
on
back
that.
on that. I'm not saying they're fascists. I didn't say they were fascists. I said they're racist.
Yeah.
And they're sitting in number 10.
Yeah.
You saw during the campaign two examples, a community get picked up, thrown under the bus for the same agenda as Farage. And that was the Bangladeshis.
Yes.
Well, Jonathan Ashworth lived to regret that. The other person that said it is the Prime Minister.
Yeah. And then he pretended that it was just the first. What was funny is he pretended it was then the first group of people that came to his mind. Why would Bangladeshis
Why
come
would
to mind?
Bangladeshis
Why
come
would
to your
and
mind?
Jonathan Ashworth had already said it. I mean, the lies that come out of these people's mouths. I think that's very valid, Becky, and I think you're right. She did not say fascist. She said racist. And actually, on this, I am totally with Becky. I feel this is a really, and I mean, look, I know, and I know at my own expense, that the Labour Party has always had quite a reasonable degree of anti-Black racism. And, you know, I remember this from my childhood when it was a Labour council that excluded my family from housing on the grounds that we were Black. So I don't have any false historical ideas about what the Labour Party has been, but I know my own experience was that it was pretty uncomfortable for many Black people in that party. And I'm not, you know, I think Jeremy without doubt would have tried to have done something about it had he not been just having or felt, and I think that's very important from what Jane said, hadn't got trapped into that always apologizing and all that silly nonsense, whereas he should have just said, I'm not discussing this, I've already answered, and actually gone on to something else. But nobody can tell me, I'm sorry, nobody can tell me from what I have heard from the shadow cabinet that the culture of that shadow cabinet has a very firm hierarchy of racism, and people of colour and Muslim people and gypsies and travellers are pretty much on the bottom of that. And what I'm talking about is just simple racism. So, I mean, I think we need to get that absolutely clear.
Well, the proof of that is the position of the Ford report in the Labour Party. I mean, a major report, took a lot of money and time, and it was, you know, initiated by Keir Starmer himself, and it remains in his bottom drawer, really. I mean, you know, it was published, but to what? To do what?
And Ford treated with huge disdain.
Absolutely.
Can you imagine a report written about anti-Semitism headed up by a Jewish QC being treated with some disdain? We can't, and there's reasons we can't. Yes, Norman.
Yeah, I think to add to that, I think that what we have to look for is what unites, the terrifying thing that unites Starmer and Farage and people like Wilders in the Netherlands, other fascists across the country. I agree, Starmer isn't a fascist, but what unites them very, very tangibly is that they see an Islamic threat to the West as something, a unifying factor in the West.
Yes.
It counts in a way for the success of the independence, because the Asian communities in the areas that supported those independents, they can see the writing on the wall as well. They can see that they're now facing a racism which comes from the Islamic threat being identified as the big threat which America and Britain and the other European countries will unite against. And people like Starmer see as a powerful force to help him impose a new military regime on the country, fighting the Arabs. That's basically what it's all about. It's not just about Gaza, it's about fighting the Arabs.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah, can I,
and I
sorry, can I
also-
just add in there? That's what I meant to say when I began earlier. This propaganda, this alliance with Israel, what it is about in Europe, this threat,
Yeah.
and that is being made legitimate. And that to me is the massive danger.
But can I just say on the other side of it, and I keep saying this, you know, the Labour vote in London went down by 2%. In my constituency, which is in southeast London, the majority of the Labour MP went down by 8,000. And that is not, my area is not very Muslim. We have many nationalities here, but relatively quite small Muslim population. And what we see there is the potential for a solidarity between young people, between the left, between radicals, between Muslims, between people of color who look at the conversation that's going on about them and they are kind of totally disgusted. I am going to kind of wind this up a little bit now because we're heading on for an hour. And I wonder if what we should do now is kind of give everybody a sort of summation time, because I think we've had some interesting conversations. And I would like, in a way, if people could leave with something positive out of this as well, because I know I am feeling a lot better today than I was before the election. So Graham, let's come to you first.
Well, I suppose since we're talking about Britain and France, France represents our tomorrow, possibly. And the difference, of course, is that the far right and the far left are both stronger in France, whereas in this country, these developments haven't taken place. But we shouldn't underestimate the significance of what could happen under a Labour government. I totally accept everything you're talking about, Islamophobia and all of that. And this, however far Starmer goes along those lines, with his no economic leeway to make concessions like Blair was able to, I think, or very little, there's going to be a huge disillusion. And I think the danger is of a far-right movement spearheaded to some extent by representatives in Parliament. And Starmer's Farage is no fascist, but he could be a link to them in the same way, as I say, Trump could be. So what's our task? It is, I don't think we should be arguing about who you support. Or I did the Crispin show the other day, and he said, we've got to prepare now for the next election. No. The area we're fighting isn't at an electoral level primarily now. It's not in Parliament now. And we've got to unite as many forces as we can in the broader movement to unite, but to try to unite on as tough a political and sharp basis as we possibly can. And if there's going to be any real movement for change, that the Starmer word, and real change, now is the time to begin to build it.
Thank you. Becky.
Yeah, I agree with Graham. What we've seen is what we can do when we unite, and we can only but build on that. So I've been involved in a campaign with like an independent Green New Deal Rising, all sorts of different groups that flooded into Hove to help Tanushka. And we have something really solid to build on. And in some ways, we are looking to the next election because we are going to keep a presence in Hove, and we are going to keep that coalition together, and we are going to build on it. And that will be building on it as we have done in this campaign with the Greens. Obviously, that creates some disagreement with some people, but with, you know, people who are taking action on Palestine, the young people who are out taking action, and that we keep them together in this movement, but we're not ignoring when an election could come, and it may not be 5 years. It may not be 5 years in Hove. It may not be 5 years in any constituency. Could be in a year.
Yeah. Norman.
Yeah, well, I agree with Graham that we need to not prepare for another election, particularly. What I do think we have to prepare for is another war, because it seems to me that's what it's all pointing to. It's back to the days of Bush and Blair. And Bush's most powerful statement from his point of view was, you're either with us or against us. And he was talking about Arab countries, Arab people. It was a racist war. And it was the absolute, I mean, it's the Hitler playbook, isn't it? These people are the threat. The Arabs are the threat. They look what they did to our New York buildings. That's what the powerful thing is. And Starmer will be right on that. And Farage will be totally either in favor or outflanked, because nothing defeats the right even more than a so-called a pseudo-left espousing patriotism. And it'll be patriotism. Starmer doesn't have those Union Jacks behind him all the time, everywhere, always. He's going to have, for an accident, he's going to have them more and more. He's going to come on our television with a Union Jack shirt. He's going to be patriotism, but he's got to have something to be patriotic about. And it's going to be some sort of war with the Arab countries. And God knows what it's going to be, but he's going to be there with the Americans. And that's what we've got to prepare for. Yes, we've got to have the people on the streets, but we've got to remember that with the Iraq war, we failed. We had a big street movement, we had huge protests, but we failed to stop the war. This time, we can't afford to fail. And we've got to be united, especially with the Arab communities in this country, to make sure that we don't fail this time. Thanks.
Jane.
Well, I think Norman's right, and that war is the thing which threatens us all. In France, you know, it's not a matter of whether you're friends of Israel. It's the matter of the EDF, you know, the electricity of France has bought the rights to fuel in just off Gaza. They've split it with the Germans, and also they want to sell their Exocet missiles. I mean, France wants to has got a military industrial partner in Israel, but that's not the root of their Islamophobia. Their Islamophobia is not so much Islamophobia as anti-Arab. And it dates really from the Algerian War. It's no coincidence really that that's where Le Pen himself comes from. He was a member of the Foreign Legion, and he began to hate the Arabs like poison when he was fighting them in Algeria. And he came back with the idea of white supremacy, and that he would do everything he could to keep any Arab or Pied Noir, even a kind of French person who'd been living in Algeria so long they'd gone native, so to speak, out of the country. So yes, it's going to be it's anti-Arab, anti-Muslim. The people around the table, as Becky says, that are racists because they're Zionists. Yeah, that's the under the radar manner in which we're sliding into our war in the Middle East again. we're always sleepwalking into war. And by the time we're ready to organize ourselves in the street as we did in the Iraq wars, well, you know, Keir Starmer will have passed the most draconian laws to make sure it's pretty uncomfortable for us to do so.
And I think what's happened in France has also lifted me,
Yeah.
and that's just
I think
terrific.
we need to watch over the next 10 days. I mean,
Yes.
the things that's really interesting in France at the moment is that, you know, Attal has been asked to stay as prime minister, not because Macron wants him to, but because Mélenchon wants him to, because it's
Yes.
need 10 days for them to sort out who they want to be prime minister. And
Yeah.
it's interesting that they give themselves the time to come together.
Yeah.
So, you know, you've got various people who, I mean, hopefully Mélenchon won't become prime minister himself, because he would never get anywhere with Macron. But there are people who are behind Laurent Berger, who's a trade union guy, and has he's part of the Front, and there are wonderful people in the Green Party. Many of their Greens are anti-NATO and anti-nuclear, not like our Greens. So you know, it's a different proposition. And there are some extremely talented young new members of Parliament, and they'll all have a hearing in choosing the Prime Minister.
I'm going to wind us up tonight. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. My take from this is that we look to France and we can see how solidarity can move mountains. And I agree with you. You know, it's not always the big demos, but there are certain things where you can put real pressure on the executive. And I think we've got to start, if you like, boxing clever, to think about how to do that. I also think my take from this is that we need to build a movement, not on the basis of exclusions. If we're going to exclude this person and that person and the other person, we are playing the game of our enemies. We have to build a solid program so that if people don't want to join that program of radical change, of anti-racism, of socialism, of solidarity, then they exclude themselves. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this discussion as much as I've enjoyed it. Thank you.